Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex DeBranco. I'm a visiting student researcher with the Center for Right-Wing Studies. I'm really excited to have you all joining us today. We're going to be speaking about health and public welfare in this panel. Our four panelists will each speak to their area of expertise for about 15 minutes, and our aim is to reserve the last 25 minutes for questions from the audience. Our first speaker, Benjamin Handel, is a University of California, Berkeley Associate Professor of Economics. He will be speaking to us about healthcare. Handel received his PhD from Northwestern and is an expert on healthcare business and policy who has worked with numerous businesses and policymakers in partnerships to research key topics in healthcare economics. His work is primarily concerned with the economic analysis of health insurance markets. He is a National Bureau of Economic Research Faculty Research Associate and co-director of its working group on insurance markets. Thank you and welcome, Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about lessons from the first 100 days.
Please speak in your
Oh, sure, yeah. Maybe I should have put lessons in quotes, since I'm not sure exactly what we've learned per se. But unlike other policy areas, in healthcare there obviously has been some activity and some action so far, and so there are some kind of concrete things to talk about. There we go. That's a lot better. So healthcare reform is one of the areas where the administration has moved fairly quickly. And obviously, as all of you know, there's been a long-running criticism by the Republican Party of the Affordable Care Act since it was passed in 2010. Okay, so somewhat to my surprise, one of the first areas that Congress chose to address in the Trump administration, as all of you know now, is healthcare, and that led to the proposal of the AHCA, the American Health Care Act, which was put together very quickly, proposed very quickly, and before we knew it, it was gone, and we were on to kind of the next version. And now we're in the phase of the process where we kind of hear different innuendos about potential rules, but still kind of very little concrete modifications to the AHCA. So the discussions are ongoing. If you kind of read what's going on in the media. From my perspective, kind of the passage of a meaningful bill in the near future seems quite unlikely, and what's more likely is kind of the status quo with kind of small changes here or there that can be done kind of probably outside of the legislative process. So what I want to do is, since probably not everybody here is a healthcare expert, I want to talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act and what some of the current dilemmas are, because those are some of the policy issues that are kind of most prevalent right now in terms of what's being discussed. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the AHCA, which is kind of what we know about kind of what Republicans have proposed for potential modifications or replacements to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and we'll talk about kind of where I think that's going. So let's talk a little bit about the ACA. What are some of the issues with the ACA that are actually kind of concrete issues that we actually might want to fix? So I'm going to approach this from the perspective of there's a lot of good things in the ACA, there's some bad things in the ACA, and I'm going to tell you about some of the things that we could modify with regulation, and then I'll tell you about some of the better things too. So one of the aspects of the ACA that hasn't quite been implemented as well, or hasn't manifested as well as we had hoped, is when we passed the bill, the hope was that we could encourage through the mandate and through subsidies that we could encourage a lot of young invincibles or young healthy people to enter the market through both of these prongs. And what that does is, when you encourage younger and healthy people to enter the market, that drives down premiums in the market, and it creates a more robust base for insurers to kind of cover their fixed costs and have a stronger presence in this market. And so what's happened in practice, something you can see in these charts on the right, is that the Congressional Budget Office projected that 40% of the market by by this point in time would be made of young Invincible, so this young and healthy group. And in practice right now, only about 28% of the markets, of the Obamacare exchanges are from this group. And so what that means is that this is like one factor contributing to the fact that premiums have been higher than expected, and insurer costs have been higher than expected. So this has led in this is one of many factors that's led to participation in the markets being slightly lower than expected. And this right now I'm talking about participation from consumers. And here what you can see is once you get past the very lowest income tier, I'm looking at the graph on the bottom left now, once you get past the very lowest income tier in terms of relationship to the federal poverty line, we're having less than 50% of eligible consumers participating in the market. And this is kind of eligible consumers who we think would want to participate in the market. So not people in these age groups who have employer-sponsored insurance, for example. Okay, and what you see in the chart on the right is that the projections were that 21 million people would have signed up by this point for an Obamacare exchange plan, and in fact 11 million people have signed up so far. So, I don't necessarily take this as a sign of success or failure per se, but what it means is that there is certainly space for policies to kind of improve what's been implemented so far. Other issues include insurer participation. So as many of you have probably seen in the news, recently there's been substantial exit from the market. So Humana left most state markets moving from 2015 to 2016. The same thing for United Health. And some of the reasons for exit, which we see kind of insurance company CEOs talk about, are high fixed costs. So you have a high fixed cost of setting up your insurance plan in the market, but not enough people signing up, which is kind of what something that we saw in the last slide. And so this kind of lack of participation from insurers has been kind of a major sticking point, because then it means that consumers have fewer options in the market and the market becomes less attractive to them. And so this is a map of the U.S. showing the number of Obamacare exchange insurers by county in the U.S. And what you can see is that there's many, many markets or counties where there's either two insurers or one insurer in the market. And that brings up a whole host of issues. So then the insurers have more market power in terms of charging higher prices. Then the state has to be a partner with this insurer and negotiate with them over what the prices are. So this has kind of caused a number of issues. Now that's kind of stuff on the negative side. On the plus side, when economists think about designing markets like those in the Affordable Care Act, insurers exiting this market is actually kind of something that we like at times, because it means that the less efficient insurers are leaving the market and hopefully more efficient insurers are coming in. So some insurers like Centene and Molina have both actually been quite successful in the Obamacare markets. So it could be that this early issue with insurers exiting and not enough participation is really just insurers learning how to work in this market. Other good things about the ACA, it's still much better than what was in place prior to the ACA in 2010, when the individual market had a lot of churn and individuals had a lot of uncertainty in terms of having their pre-existing conditions priced. So there's a much better insurance experience, and some of the state markets are functioning really well. So those are some of my thoughts on some of the current issues with the ACA and how people are thinking about it. When we're thinking about attempts to repeal and replace the ACA, which is kind of turning to the Trump administration and Congress and policy now, the expectations, as many of you know, were very lofty or very high. So the expectations were, we're going to repeal Obamacare on day one, and then we're going to replace it later. Okay, and so this was a big talking point during the election campaign. Of course, this didn't happen, and reality was much more complicated. So I'll step away from the microphone just for a second to point at this. And some of you probably saw this. What you can see is, the Trump quote, "Nobody knew healthcare could be so complicated." And then more kind of substantively, when the CBO scored the bill and when people looked at the bill, Obamacare repeal, it just outright repeal without any replacement plan, could cost 32 million people health insurance, and that kind of a nonpartisan study says. So basically, once they actually got into office, they kind of realized very quickly, oh, this is actually really, it's hard to do repeal without replace, and the reason is that doing repeal basically just hurts a lot of people right now, and it was very unpopular. So one implication of this is that the Obamacare approval ratings have actually been going up quite a bit since the AHCA was discussed. And so what you can see here in this chart on the far right is a big uptick, or big from a relative perspective, in approval for the ACA in 2017 since Trump was elected. And actually, since I put these slides together a few weeks ago, this has even continued to diverge. So the ACA, in some sense, has never been more popular, and I think that part of that is contrasting that with kind of the policies that have been proposed in the AHCA. So what are some of the issues with the AHCA, and how do I think about that? So with the AHCA, the way I think about this kind of very, 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 very loosely is that, in essence, the ACA, since it's a market-based policy, is similar to what a Republican healthcare plan would look like. And in fact, a lot of the tenets of the ACA were kind of first proposed by Republican think tanks in the 1990s. And so what this has led to in terms of policy right now with the AHCA is that the Republicans want to repeal and replace the ACA, but doing that while achieving the goals of nobody losing coverage and consumers paying less is really, really hard to do in another conservative framework. And part of the reason is that the ACA is already, in many ways, kind of what conservatives would have passed, or similar to what conservatives would have passed. And one way you can see that is with Medicare Part D, prescription drug insurance for the elderly. That was passed by conservatives in 2003, and in fact, that has a lot of similarities to the exchanges in the ACA. So I only have a couple minutes left. I do want to talk briefly about kind of get into the weeds a little bit and talk about some of the details. 5 minutes, great. What I want to do is I want to outline some of the components that are staying the same and some of the components that were proposed to change. And to be clear, there's been no law that's been passed and no law on the horizon that's going to be passed. So staying the same here means staying the same under the proposed AHCA law if it were to be passed, and changing means changing. And what I want you to have in mind here is kind of these are the things that Republican policymakers are thinking about in the context of healthcare right now. So staying the same, the exchange markets and infrastructure for Obamacare, kind of free market provision of insurance through the exchanges. That, as I mentioned, was already kind of something that Republicans are friendly to. The two things in purple here, essential health benefits, which is kind of guaranteed categories of healthcare that have to be covered by insurers, and no pricing of pre-existing conditions, which means the insurer can't charge you a separate price if you have a serious medical condition or not. These things are in purple because in the original AHCA legislation, these things were staying the same, so these weren't changing from Obamacare. But in the kind of backroom discussions you hear about in the media, these are kind of provisions that have been discussed as kind of coming out of the law, so things that are changing or removing. And when they talk about changing or removing those things, the popularity of the stated popularity of the AHCA in surveys goes down. So these are things which are very popular with consumers. So what are things that are changing or that were proposed to change? Replacing the individual mandate, saying that everybody has to have insurance, with something called the continuous coverage provision. The continuous coverage provision basically says we're going to charge you a 30% premium penalty for your health insurance if you're not insured for 63 days. So it's similar to a mandate in that it's trying to get people to participate in the market, but it has some qualities, which I won't go into now, which actually make it a little bit worse than the mandate as an economic policy. The other notable things to mention here, I won't kind of talk about each of these things, are that the bill proposed pullback of the Medicaid expansion. So the Affordable Care Act, it greatly expanded Medicaid insurance for low-income individuals, and the AHCA intended to roll that back by 2020 and maybe earlier if the kind of Freedom Caucus type crowd got their way. The other thing to point out is that the subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, which to give insurance, to help poorer people gain insurance, which were a really important part of that, in this proposed change, those would be based on age and not income. And basically the result of that is you'd be kind of heavily redistributing money in this market from poorer people to people who are more well off. And so those are some of the provisions I think you could expect if a health bill is kind of ultimately passed. So to kind of wrap up the AHCA, it was really unpopular with polling. So in kind of one of the most cited Quinnipiac polls, only 17% people approved. There were meaningful kind of public outcry at town halls and things like that. And maybe most importantly, there was key interest groups really disapproved of this law. So the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, the AARP all came out and said, we don't like this replacement law, which should be a death knell for insurance. This translated politically into a very difficult situation. So politically, what happened was, both moderate Republicans and very kind of hardline conservatives disliked the AHCA, and they disliked it for completely opposite reasons. Okay, moderate Republicans, they wanted to keep Medicaid expansion, they wanted to keep the subsidies, they wanted to keep no pricing on pre-existing conditions, and the Freedom Caucus or the hardline conservatives wanted the exact opposite. So they want to get rid of essential health benefits and allow insurers to price based on pre-existing conditions, as well as get rid of the Medicaid expansion. So what we've seen as there have kind of been negotiations about the bill, are that it's a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole, if you know what that is, like in the arcade, because basically what happens is that they'll say, well, okay, we're going to design the bill to keep in Medicaid, so the moderate Republicans like it, and then the hardline conservatives say, no, now we're not going to vote for it. But then when you go in the reverse direction, you say, okay, and they've said we're going to remove essential health benefits and pricing on pre-existing conditions, then the moderate Republicans say we're not going to vote for this. So basically, there hasn't been any configuration of these different policies that has really seemed like it would garner support from both of those groups in a way that kind of gave enough support to the bill. And you can kind of see some of the things here. So, this is my last slide. What's coming, I think, healthcare is, unlike probably some of the other areas that the other panelists are going to talk about, it's an area where I think we actually already know something about the policy or the potential policies in the Trump administration and under this Congress. We know that the policies that they've proposed as currently constructed are not going to pass and certainly won't pass. And so I think, in my opinion, I think it's very unlikely there's going to be a meaningful health bill that's passed. Probably the most you'll see is a smaller health bill with some modifications or some incremental changes. And additional policies just to have in mind as we kind of go forward are, will the Trump administration support the ACA as there's no replacement bill? Will they kind of pay the cost-sharing subsidies and things like that, which are heavily in the news? Or will they try to attack other policy areas like health savings accounts, the tax exemption for insurance that employers get, or try to change something more structural about insurance contracts, like how long-term the contracts are? So I think, we know a little bit about what's going on, and I think it's likely that we're going to get a lot of the status quo with a lot of talk, especially over the next few months to a year. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker on reproductive and women's rights is Melissa Murray, a Berkeley Law professor and interim dean, and the faculty director for the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice. Her research focuses on the roles that criminal law and family law play in articulating the legal parameters of intimate life, topics such as marriage and its alternatives, legal regulation of sex and sexuality, the marriage equality debate, and reproductive rights and justice. She was co-author with Kristen Luker of Cases on Reproductive Rights and Justice. Murray is a graduate of Yale Law School who went on to clerk for Sonia Sotomayor, who was then of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Court. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And many thanks to the panelists for these great presentations and the opportunity to talk about some of these issues, because it has been quite 100 days. It was obvious, at least to me, at the beginning of the campaign that the Trump administration would likely mean some very striking changes in the landscape for women and women's rights. As a candidate, Trump was unequivocal in his hostility to reproductive rights, such as the constitutionally protected right to abortion. Throughout the campaign and in televised debates, he decried what he called partial birth abortions. He stated that Planned Parenthood should be defunded as a de facto abortion factory, and stated that women should be punished for having abortions. His choice of a running mate underscored this antipathy for reproductive rights. As governor of Indiana, Mike Pence was a stalwart opponent of abortion rights, signing into law some of the most restrictive abortion regulations in the country. But it's Trump's choices upon entering office that are perhaps most striking. Within days of taking office, exactly 2 days of taking office, Trump, surrounded by a council of men, signed an executive order reinstating the Mexico City policy, otherwise known as the global gag rule. First implemented by then-President Ronald Reagan in 1984, the policy bans the use of federal funds for international organizations that provide abortions. And indeed, it even restricts international organizations from providing information about abortion in their family planning services. Now, the global gag rule has been a kind of political football over the years. It was rescinded by President Clinton in the 1990s, reinstated in a somewhat weaker form than the Trump imposition by George W. Bush in the early 2000s, and then again rescinded by President Obama when he took office in 2009. So again, we are now in a situation where federal funding, not just at the domestic level, but also at the international level, will continue to be restricted for any organization that even dares to talk about abortion services as part of its family planning programs. The other issue that I want to raise is the nominations to the administration. Trump's nominations have signaled a clear retreat on gender progress, both in terms of representation and in terms of substance. As an initial matter, this cabinet is the most undiverse in terms of gender and racial and ethnic representation than any other presidential first cabinet since Ronald Reagan. That is in 1981. As of March 10th, 2007, of the 16 cabinet positions in the line of presidential succession, only 2 are occupied by women. Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao, who is 12th in the order of presidential succession, and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, no stranger to controversy, 14th in the order of presidential succession. In the outer cabinet, those positions that are not included in the line of presidential succession, there are again only 2 women, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and Linda McMahon, who is the administrator of the Small Business Administration. I will also note there are only 3 people of color in the entire cabinet: Elaine Chao, as well as Secretary of Labor Alex Acosta, and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Ben Carson. In terms of substance, we have a new Attorney General, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, who has been a staunch opponent of reproductive rights and equal pay legislation. He has also expressed skepticism about the validity and veracity of claims of workplace gender discrimination. Also noteworthy is the first nominee to the Supreme Court, Judge Neil Gorsuch. Although Judge Gorsuch, as a judge on the 10th Circuit, lacked a clear judicial record on abortion rights, his scholarly writings on euthanasia make clear that he is someone who is skeptical of the right to an abortion, and certainly and is in favor of certain restrictions on abortion rights. More troublingly, though, as a judge on the 10th Circuit, Gorsuch joined that court's opinion in the Hobby Lobby case, which held that an employer could invoke his or her religious views to avoid providing insurance coverage to employees for certain types of birth control under the Affordable Care Act. As you know, that decision was, of course, affirmed by the Supreme Court. In addition to these nominations, The administration has also suggested the possibility of floating an executive order that would create wholesale exemptions for people and organizations who claim religious objections to same-sex marriage, premarital sex, abortion, and transgender identity. Now, after a draft of this order was leaked to the press, the administration walked it back, but they have not disavowed any further attempts to bring this forward in the future. Now, Professor Handel brought up the Affordable Care Act, and I too wish to talk about that. As Professor Handel discussed, the Trump administration has been adamant about dismantling the ACA as one of its primary priorities. What may get lost in the shuffle, though, is that the ACA has actually made it possible for millions of women to get health insurance that includes coverage for birth control at no additional cost, as well as prenatal care. And it's worth noting that prior to the Affordable Care Act, there were a number of health insurance providers that did not specifically include prenatal care in their coverage of all people, including women. Further, the Affordable Care Act includes coverage for other vital services that women take advantage of, including lactation support services and doula services that are made available to new mothers. Now, surprisingly, there have been some glimmers of hope, at least to my mind. In March, when the president addressed Congress, he surprised many by mentioning the need to provide young families with paid family leave. This was exciting to me until I read the details. The Trump proposal, which has been spearheaded and credited to first daughter Ivanka Trump, is actually not exactly family leave. Specifically, it is maternity leave that is available only to married birth mothers. Further, the policy is strikingly inadequate, providing only 6 weeks at partial pay, making it out of reach for low-income women and those who have medical complications from birth or recovery. It also fails to address the serious health conditions that might exist for the individual or for loved ones who are not newborns, such as aging parents, young children, spouses, and partners, the kind of caregiving work that traditionally and disproportionately falls on women. Happily, this policy is likely unconstitutional, which makes me very excited because I want to be the one to write the brief arguing this. Not only is it strikingly inadequate, it is unconstitutional because it promotes and perpetuates sex stereotypes about caregiving. While workers who have given birth clearly need sufficient time to physically recover, limiting paid leave to mothers and married mothers at that perpetuates the notion that only women can and should care for children. But perhaps we ought not be surprised by this focus. After all, it has been put forth by a president who bragged that he's never changed a diaper, even though he's 5 children, and has described his marital division of labor as, "I'll supply the funds, she'll take care of the kids," and who's characterized men who participate equally in parenting as acting like the wife. The family leave policy's restrictions of benefits to married birth mothers also ignores the fact that it is unmarried mothers who are more likely to be heads of households, to have lower household income, and to struggle with poverty, the very types of people who could most benefit from family leave. And again, in a step that is vastly inconsistent with where our society has been going, it ignores everyone else, dads, non-birth mothers in same-sex partnerships, two-father families, and adoptive parents, all of whom need time to care for and bond with the newest members of their family and to care for other members of their families. So this gives you a direct sense of some of the things that have been percolating in just 100 days. Just 100. But I want to make clear that despite these very clear policy directions, to my mind, the greatest impact that this administration has had on women and women's rights has been largely symbolic and expressive. By this I mean, it means something. It is deeply meaningful to have someone who has joked about committing sexual assault, who has advocated a gender division of household labor, and who has discounted the prevalence and impact of workplace sexual harassment as this country's leader. Further, the fact that there are strong allies in the White House has emboldened those who are opposed to reproductive rights and women's rights to push further at the state and local levels. And again, I cannot underscore enough how important state and local politics is at this point in time. Not only have we seen a federal Congress where both houses and the presidency are under control of a single party, we have seen the very same thing at the state level throughout this country. That makes it increasingly easier to put forth what I have seen over the last 100 days, and that's a strong uptick in anti-abortion regulations, and indeed some of the most restrictive abortion legislation that we've seen in years. Laws that require burial or cremation services for fetal remains, both as an effort to honor the fetus, but also as an attempt to drive up the cost of abortion services to make it inaccessible. We've also seen more lengthy waiting periods for women seeking abortion, and perhaps not out of step with some of the other things that we've seen at the federal level, we've seen more laws that now permit husbands to sue their wives' physicians for providing abortion services. Now, while this administration's impact on reproductive rights is clear and has been much discussed in the media, we haven't really discussed what this administration means for reproductive justice. And to make that clear, I want to draw a distinction between reproductive rights on the one hand and reproductive justice on the other. Reproductive rights concerns itself primarily with access to abortion and access to contraception. Clear things are very important, but that should not exhaust our concerns in the realm of reproductive health. And for that reason, reproductive justice demands that we think about other things, more than just contraception and abortion. Reproductive justice demands that we think not only about preventing or avoiding pregnancy, but rather with furnishing all women with the opportunity to make choices about their reproductive lives, including the choice to become a mother and to raise children in conditions of equality, safety, and security. And that means when women do make this choice, a reproductive justice lens demands that we have the conditions to do this effectively. And that means access to health care, food security, safe communities, and safe schools. And when you think about that broader lens, it is clear then that this administration's policies on abortion and contraception and family planning are not the only thing that stand out as anti-woman. It is the other policies that also cut to the heart of the things that women care about. An immigration policy that would sever parents from their children. A travel ban that would divide families across oceans. A criminal justice policy that regards some among us simply as criminals to be cataloged by a carceral state. Now, these issues nominally relate to immigration policy and criminal justice, but I want to contend here that these are also reproductive justice issues, issues that go to the heart of what it means to raise children and to raise a family in secure conditions in this country. And for those reasons, these issues, as much as abortion and contraception, should be understood as women's issues, and this administration's assault on these issues should also be understood as assaults on women as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next presenter, Fred Locke, research professor of sociology at UC Davis, will speak for us on science and climate. Locke's areas of interest include political economy, economic sociology, political sociology, innovation policy, and social theory. His most recent books are The Power of Market Fundamentalism, Carl Polanyi's Critique with Margaret R. Summers, and State of Innovation, the U.S. Government's Role in Technology Policy with Matthew R. Keller. He is an editor of Politics and Society and has organized the Center for Engaged Scholarship, an entity that supports progressive social science scholarship. Welcome, Fred. Right here.
And this is forward.
And turn it on presenter mode.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. These are tough acts to follow. I thought I would do something a little bit different, which is shamelessly talk about the Obama administration rather than the Trump administration, on the theory that we didn't want to leave here to, suicidally depressed, but also that we've seen, like the armada that was steaming towards North Korea that was actually going in the opposite direction. We've already seen so many U-turns in the Trump policy agenda that it's really hard to say with any certainty what's actually happening around climate and science policy. So it's true that on climate policy, where I'll start, the early indications are horrible. Pruitt at the EPA is a horror. He's destroying the agency. The morale is they've already approved several of the fossil fuel pipelines that had been the focus of so much mobilization. The president has signed an executive order announcing the intention to undo the Obama fuel efficiency standards and the Clean Power Plan, and we know that they're debating within the administration whether they should pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement altogether. But what I wanted to do was just say that while the climate situation continues to be extremely serious and grave, and that the whole world should have been taking even much more forceful action over the past 10 or 15 years, it's important to recognize that the Obama administration did something quite phenomenal around clean energy technologies that they haven't gotten credit for in the public debate. And so the data that I'm showing you is from a Department of Energy report that I think came out in October of last year. It's literally called Revolution Now, and they go through 5 of the technologies in particular. The first is wind power, and basically, when you get down here, this is a nickel a kilowatt for wind power, which makes it market competitive. We've now seen reports that in Europe, contracts are being put out for wind power without any subsidy at all because the cost has been brought down so far. And you see the upward chart on capacity. This is something which is going to continue to go on. What I'm trying to argue is that the clean energy revolution is not easily reversed by Donald Trump. You can see something similar with the solar photovoltaic. This is just the utility scale, but again, in a very short period of time, very much because of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus bill in 2009, and the investments and the policies that the Obama administration, they brought those costs down very, very dramatically, and again, creating the increasing potential just through market forces alone. This is light-emitting diodes, those most efficient light bulbs, which you should all go out and buy and replace your energy. That, again, hugely dramatic cost reduction, again, in a very short period of time. The official reports essentially say that these LED bulbs, they save 75 to 80% of the energy as compared to an incandescent bulb, and they're supposed to last 25 times longer. So, once you've brought the cost curves down like that, the impact is very dramatic. And then the last one are the advanced batteries for electric cars. And again, you see an extremely dramatic decline, and this decline is ongoing. That the reports in the literature are that a number of auto firms are reporting that they've gotten below the $200 a kilowatt hour threshold. So this is going to continue, and the consequence is that we are going to see this electrification of the transportation system take place. They're not going to make the cars run on coal. So the point that I'm trying to get at is that what we need, obviously, at this point are a whole set of policies to accelerate these changes to get much more broad distribution, and the Trump administration is going to block those kinds of measures, but they're not going to be able to turn the tide, to return us to the era of fossil fuels. Now, I'm going to segue from here to science and technology and innovation, and I'm going to talk about an initiative that the Obama administration carried out that I think practically nobody has ever heard of, even though it was quite a substantial program. And it's ironic because, as you remember, Donald Trump ran on the agenda of bringing manufacturing back in the U.S. Well, it happened that the Obama administration had a very sophisticated plan to essentially renew manufacturing in the U.S. by focusing on advanced manufacturing, those industries which are emergent that depend upon very sophisticated advanced technologies. And so, basically the idea of the program was to create ultimately something like 45 advanced manufacturing institutes located in different places around the country. And the idea was that each one of these advanced manufacturing institutes would hopefully become the hub of a new advanced manufacturing industry. And that the idea was that each of the institutes would fund research to make these technologies, to move these technologies to commercial availability. And they would also work on developing the labor force with the appropriate skills to make it possible for that industry to fill its factories. Now, again, Trump's arguments were for, basically returning steel jobs and all kinds of other manufacturing jobs, which we know are never coming back. And we also know what's never coming back are factories where, 10,000, 20,000 people work every day. When we're talking advanced manufacturing, we're talking robotics, we're talking about high levels of automation, even very big factories like the Tesla battery factory in Nevada. They're going to, at the most, maybe employ 500, 1,000 people. I mean, we're talking not about a return of the industrial era. But the idea here is that building up these industries can be essentially a nucleus for reviving the economy in different parts of the country. And the kind of main idea behind it is the idea that co-locating research and development and production is absolutely essential for these technologies. And so the U.S. pattern has been that we've been in the lead in research and development in industry after industry, but then the firms move to East Asia for production. And that the record is that where the production takes place, with the single exception of the Apple iPhone, iPad, and so forth, that the general pattern is when production moves abroad, R&D moves abroad as well. And so the theory behind the Obama measures was that if we are going to keep R&D in this country, we're going to have to keep production in this country and have co-location. And there's a terrific book that came out of MIT, Making in America, by Suzanne Berger, which essentially makes this argument. So it's, again, an argument for manufacturing, but it's different from the old-fashioned industrial policy arguments. Did I? Oh, okay. So what I haven't told you yet is kind of the scale of this initiative by the Obama administration. That by the time they finished, they had established somewhere between 8 and 14 of these advanced manufacturing institutes. And the precise number is hard to know because of the transition. You know, they were doing this up until the last day of the administration, and some of these institutes have kind of been rolled out, and it's hard to know whether they actually exist or not. But we have an independent report on the first 8 of the institutes that was done by Deloitte Consulting, and they report that the first 8 institutes involved $600 million of federal dollars and another $1.3 billion in dollars that came from state government, local government, universities, and private industry. And this is the key thing here, which is that despite all of the kind of market absolutist or market fundamentalist rhetoric, corporate America, the big corporations, recognize that they need the government. I mean, again, with the exception of the Koch brothers and their hedge fund trading friends, the rest of the corporate sector understands their need for the federal government. So that this Deloitte report shows that the first 8 institutes had, as of the end of last year, 753 members. The idea is that private firms sign up and join. Sometimes they pay dues. They're very much parties to this. So this is just the diagram for one of the first of the advanced manufacturing institutes was for 3D printing, additive manufacturing, and it's called America Makes. And what you see here is that the green dots represent large corporations that are affiliated with this institute that's based in Youngstown, Ohio. And the blue are small, and then the purple, I think, are universities. So what they've done already, this was the first one that was created, is that they have built the active interconnections with industry, with universities, with the scientific community to essentially move 3D printing into the mainstream of manufacturing. And again, it's not going to create giant factories, but it is central to the project of economic revitalization. So one of the ironies, to me the greatest irony, is that Youngstown, Ohio, where this first of the advanced manufacturing institutes was essentially the poster child in the campaign for depressed blue-collar areas that had gone over to Trump. In fact, Hillary did win the county in which Youngstown is located, but it's a very strongly Democratic county, and she won it just by a little, whereas Democrats usually win it by 70-80%. But that the irony of all of this is that, for reasons which I don't really understand, this Advanced Manufacturing Institute was not reported by the press. didn't exist in terms of the public. Hillary couldn't say, I'm going to build on Obama's initiative, because nobody knew about that initiative. And it wasn't that the Obama administration was quiet. They were shouting at the top of their lungs. Obama would go to Indiana, he would go to Ohio to open one of these institutes to have a big ribbon cutting. And the press would report that he went to that city, but they wouldn't explain why he went there. So I'll stop there. I have a couple of places where you can go to find out more information. But essentially, the closing idea is that we do have ideas about economic renewal. They were being pursued by the last administration, and they are part of the package of progressive policies that need to be part of the alternative to Trump that we advance over the next few years. Thanks.
Before I introduce our next speaker, I want to remind everybody that if you have a question to ask, please write it down on the note card on your seat and hold it up for collection. If you need another note card, raise your hand and someone will come around and bring one for you. Now, our final speaker, Jenelle Scott, is a Chancellor's Associate Professor at UC Berkeley in the Graduate School of Education, Goldman School of Public Policy, and African American Studies Department. She earned a PhD in Education Policy from UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, and before earning her doctorate, she worked as an elementary school teacher in Oakland. Her research focuses on the relationship between education, policy, and equality of opportunity, and looks at three areas in particular: the racial politics of public education, the politics of school choice, marketization, and privatization, and the role of elite and community-based advocacy in shaping public education policies and research evidence utilization. Welcome, Janelle.
Thank you, and thank you to the Center for having me and to all of you for hanging in there. I know it's a long session and try and keep this moving along. So as I was preparing for today, I think our last panelist used the word suicidal. I wouldn't go that far. I regard myself as a critical optimist. It's on my Twitter profile. You can see it. But it was hard to not get a little dispirited because honestly, I had forgotten all the things that had happened in public education over the last 100 days. So this is represented in the appointment of our Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who Professor Murray mentioned. Her appointment was not just concerning because she thought we needed guns in schools to stave off grizzly bears, or that she didn't know really the fundamental basics of education policy and measurement, like the difference between proficiency and growth, or that she essentially donated her way into the position. There's so much more. She was confirmed in one of the narrowest confirmation hearings of record. Her record is as an heiress, a school choice advocate, and as I said, a Republican donor who has never worked in public schools and whose children did not attend public schools. So that's where we are in leading the Federal Department of Education. So I want to talk about, as we've heard, I think a theme in the panel has been, there's been a lot of rhetoric, there have been some signals to movement, but so far not as much action in terms of policy. And so I want to talk about some of the rhetorical moves that we're hearing out of the Federal Department of Education. And what I want to argue here is that we're hearing individualism cloaked in a radical redefinition of the purpose and the promise of education. And so a co-optation of what counts as equity and civil rights recast as individual rights. And you hear this in the words of our secretary herself, where she says, "Our nation's commitment is to provide a quality education to every child to serve the greater public common good. Accordingly, we must shift the paradigm to think about education funding as investments made in individual children, not in institutions or buildings." Let me say that again. I believe we must change the way we think about funding education and invest in children, not buildings. And we could spend probably the rest of the afternoon critiquing and deconstructing this rationale, but I just want to put it out there because this really does mark a sea change in how our national leadership is seeing the purpose of public schools. It's even more extreme in that Secretary DeVos's signature issue is the expansion of school choice policy. We know that this was her issue in Michigan. She tried very hard to get a voucher program passed in Michigan in 2000. That was unsuccessful. But she has since invested in charter schools, other aspects of school choice reform, including privately funded voucher programs. She tried to collapse the purpose of historically black colleges and universities with her overall agenda for school choice policies. And this was at a White House meeting on February. Black History Month was a pretty active time for President Trump and Secretary DeVos in this reframing that I'm talking about. And so, in meeting with HBCU leaders, she collapses, right, the purpose of HBCUs as starting from the fact that there were too many students in America who did not have equal access to education. They saw that the system wasn't working, that there was an absence of opportunity, so they took it upon themselves to provide the solution. HBCUs are real pioneers when it comes to school choice. They're living proof that when more options are provided to students, they are afforded greater access and greater quality. And so you hear her removing, right, the state from this equation, and the fact that the state actually prevented black people from accessing not only K-12 schooling, but higher education as the cause for the establishment of HBCUs, and rather it was just a matter of populating more choice alternatives for black people. So racism doesn't matter, the state doesn't matter in this diagnosis. This formulation gets reified as our secretary has a very bumpy month in February. After her confirmation, she attempts to visit a public school in Washington, D.C., and is barred from entry from parents and some community members. A columnist in the News Democrat, an Illinois paper, depicts this incident comparing the treatment of Betsy DeVos by parents who are critical of her perspective on public education and public school teachers with the experience of Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, who required National Guard protection to desegregate a school in New Orleans. And so you see this conflation being taken up, and Glenn McCoy, the cartoonist, explained that mistreatment is mistreatment, and we needed to see it as such. And so there's no difference between the secretary. And the slur behind Ruby Bridges, which I won't say, is shown on this depiction that conservative is the same thing as a racial ethnic slur. So there we are. So let's talk about the Trump education policy agenda. Around school choice, again, Secretary DeVos's signature issue and an issue President Trump campaigned on, the proposed fiscal year budget for 2018 is proposing to create a $250 million private school choice program, a voucher program, and to further increase charter school grant allocations, which were quite high under Obama. They outpaced magnet school funding, for example, by twice as much. It cuts a voluntary desegregation program called Opening Doors, Expanding Opportunities. Again, this was voluntary. It was to help communities that wanted to desegregate and equalize their schools. That has been cut in this first 100 days. Around civil rights, the acting head of the Office of Civil Rights is Candace Jackson. Candace Jackson's record is as a conservative and libertarian. She's worked for Judicial Watch. She wrote a book on the women who have accused Bill Clinton of impropriety and arranged for their presence at one of the debates, you'll recall, but has also written against programs that support minority students, criticizes feminists, is opposed to affirmative action even in private institutions, and has been critical of the idea of compulsory education and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This Office of Civil Rights has been very important under Obama. There's a staff of 550 whose charge it is to investigate complaints of civil rights infractions, including school discipline, sexual harassment, and assault. And so that is who is now overseeing OCR. And as Professor Murray talked about, we know that there has been collaboration under Obama with the Department of Justice. And so if we imagine then the collaboration of OCR with DOJ, then you get a picture of how quality of opportunity is going to be meted out under this administration. So we're seeing an emphasis then on choice and liberty. passing to states to determine rights for GLBTQ students. We're seeing threats to immigrant and undocumented students and their parents, which certainly impacts schools, and proposed cuts to after-school programs and school lunch programs. Around higher education, which I won't talk about as much, we know that Jerry Falwell Jr., president of Liberty University, was appointed to head a higher education task force to reform our higher education system. The fiscal year budget proposes almost a $200 million cut from TRIO and other undergraduate preparation programs at universities and colleges around the country, and a rollback of student loan protections that were passed under Obama. So that's actually quite a lot in 100 days. But Secretary DeVos didn't stop at comparing choice to the founding of HBCUs. She really sees schools and the choice of schools to be like these sharing services in terms of transportation and hotels. So this is a long quote, and I actually cut quite a bit, but there's just so much in that. This is an address that she gave at the Brookings Institution in March, where she says, just like the traditional taxi system revolted against ride-sharing, so too does the education establishment feel threatened by the rise of school choice. In both cases, the entrenched status quo has resisted models that empower individuals. Nobody mandates that you take an Uber or a Lyft over a taxi, nor should they. But if you think ride-sharing is the best option for you, the government shouldn't get in your way. The truth is that in practice, people like having more options. They like being able to choose between Uber Pool, Uber X, Lyft Line, Lyft Plus, and many others. I had no idea she knew so much, by the way, about all the options. Or when it comes to taking a family trip, many like options like Airbnb. We celebrate the benefits of choices in transportation and in lodging, but doesn't that pale in comparison to the importance of educating the future of our country? Why do we not allow parents to exercise that same right to choice in the education of their child? So we see here again this insistence that really it's about parents choosing on behalf of their child and the rights of the individuals. And really this is a logic that's the culmination of efforts, decades of efforts by groups like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and other conservative funders to reframe the purposes of public education around one aspect of the mid-century civil rights movement, which is individual empowerment, right? And to remove the role of the state in securing that access. So, as many have pointed out, though, the Obama administration was also a champion of many of the same school choice policies that the Trump administration is proposing, and this followed what was on trend for the Bush and Clinton administrations as well. So what does that look like around the country? We have charter school laws in 42 states. There are magnet schools and inter- and intra-district choice plans that really come out of the school desegregation efforts. There are 17 school voucher plans, 40 tuition tax credit plans. About 2 million children are being homeschooled. We also have seen the emergence of private school management and virtual schooling companies, really altering the way public schools are not only operating but being governed, because these organizations have private boards that oversee curriculum, personnel, and a whole host of other issues traditionally handled by school districts. Charters are authorized by districts or counties or states, but really operate as autonomous school districts. And we're seeing now that as the charter school movement has grown and the numbers of charter schools have grown, particularly in urban school districts, a real strain being placed on districts and their ability to maintain their existing schools. And that has resulted in school closures, in consolidations, and teacher and staff layoffs. We know, however, from the research evidence that only about a quarter of charter schools around reading and math scores in particular are outperforming traditional public schools, right? And that about 50% and 40% in math are performing about the same, and we have a share that are performing much worse. The Obama administration was really trying to concentrate on the piece in the blue, right? The high-performing charter schools, and really invested in efforts to replicate those. But we know that these metrics are hiding a lot of details in implementation. For example, we know that charter schools under-enroll special education students, and when they do enroll special education students, those children tend to have much less severe learning disabilities or physical disabilities. We know that the charter school sector is constituted or characterized by high rates of racial and ethnic segregation, linguistic segregation, and that there has been a tremendous amount of private money been invested in the charter school movement in terms of real estate development and other aspects, online education and the like. So I know I'm running out of time. This money has also contributed to an education reform and advocacy organizational sector that has been very active on the left and the right in developing these policies. And as the Trump administration has emerged with its vision of school choice, we're seeing the choice community on the left in terms of advocacy pulling back a bit from some of this advocacy. And so I think that's something to watch, not only in the next 100 days, but for the next few years. And much of that rethinking has been in private. I don't think it's made it into the public sphere yet. We know that for groups who have been opposed to school choice expansion, many of whom have been parents that Secretary DeVos is not acknowledging in terms of their choice to a traditional public school, that those groups are much less well-resourced in this sector. And these are just an example of some of the groups. So, in terms of the next 100 days, I think we should expect to see some sort of school voucher or tax credit legislation in Congress. We know that there's a proposed $9 million cut to the Department of Education. But I also don't want to let go that the Southern Poverty Law Center has been documenting the rise in violent and racist incidents and hate speech, and has shown that many of these have been in schools. It had more than 700 incidents in the first 10 days after the election. And so schools are really grappling with this new reality, regardless of the sort of choice and civil rights issues that are happening in Washington. And really the ability for this administration to investigate and adjudicate those are compromised with the current staff. As I said, that we're going to see, I think, a continued retreat from voluntary desegregation plans, possible sanctions for sanctuary cities and sanctuary school districts who are resisting the immigration policies of the administration, a retreat from the enforcement and investigation of civil rights and sexual violence and harassment, many of which has been focused on colleges and universities, as those of us at Berkeley know all too well. And I think we'll see an even greater rise in for-profit and religious provision of K-12 and higher education services. So, thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. This was a really fascinating panel. I'm going to start with a question on reproductive rights issues. The question is, what do you know / predict about funding for international reproductive health and family policy and HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment in foreign countries via USAID?
So, as I said in the presentation, the current administration has reinstated the Mexico City policy, or the global gag rule, which prevents the use of federal funding for any organization that provides abortion or even counsels individuals about abortion. What we do know about this policy is when it was reinstated by the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, in a weaker form, it actually had an enormous impact on other programming that international aid organizations did, including STI prevention and HIV prevention. So there's a sharp uptick in both STI transmission and HIV transmission in countries where these organizations were working but were unable to use federal funding because of the limits on abortion. So these are often inextricably linked. When you're providing abortion and family planning services, you're also thinking about contraception, also thinking about HIV and STI prevention. So they're all inextricably linked, and taking out abortion will often set back the work that these organizations will do, preventing them from doing the other work they do that are not necessarily abortion related. So I imagine we will again see, as we saw in the Bush administration, a sharp uptick in the transmission of sexually transmitted infections and HIV in these international contexts.
Great, thank you. The next question asks all of the panelists to speak to the prospects for the states, especially California, to go their own way on the issues that have been discussed today. And in particular, a question on the feasibility and prospects for single-payer healthcare and mitigating the undermining of ACA that will be coming from the Trump administration on the state level.
That's a tough question.
For the first part of the first part.
with the, I'll just speak loudly.
Can you stand up so we can
Sure. With the state-specific nature of things, the ACA or California has really gone its own way, and part of that is that the ACA regulation, it's a federal regulation, but the exchange markets are already state-by-state markets that are being implemented in each state. The fact that the markets are already implemented state by state means that each state already has, most states have their own flavor of a market already, have their own regulatory commission, etc. And so the long story short of this is that California's exchange already is quite customized relative to even what the federal law has. And the California exchange is one example, I think one of the most successful examples of a market that's been implemented in Obamacare. And so I think any health law that's ultimately passed will, at a minimum, still allow the exchange markets and give the states the ability to regulate those markets how they see fit. And in that case, I think the California market will actually continue to be successful and continue to look similar to what it looks like under the ACA. For the move to single payer, people discuss it. I think, practically, I think it's very unlikely.
We currently have a bill in the State House here.
I don't know about that, Bill, but practically it's difficult, and there's a number of reasons, including the fact that insurers are so prominent in the market and have so much influence in the market already. And the fact that the California exchanges are functioning fairly well also probably makes that less likely. I'm certainly not saying that would be bad or good. That's not maybe that way.
So on clean energy, the California has the opportunity to, if the Trump administration reverses the fuel efficiency standards for automobiles that was agreed to under Obama, which they've promised to do, California has the opportunity to hold on to higher standards, and then there's likely to be a political fight, a legal fight as to whether California has that authority. And you know that these people are for states' rights always until it happens to be an issue where corporate interests can benefit from federalizing it.
In terms of education, I think California is actually well positioned to sort of resist many of the directives coming out of DC. Education is unique in that it is a state's right? I mean, that's the way it's written into our Constitution, that it's devolved to the states. But California, I think, is especially well positioned with the team of Jerry Brown and Michael Kirst, Tim Torkelson, Linda Darden-Hammond was a head of the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. So these are folks who know a lot about public education and who have thought really hard, I think, about public education policy. And we have some interesting moves in California around a new funding system, the local control funding formula, which sends more money to poor districts, an accountability plan that's trying to be much more holistic. I don't think, things are far from perfect in California around schooling, and so I don't want to romanticize the challenges and issues, but I think the leaders in Sacramento are more strong in terms of being able to articulate and execute a very different plan for California than is being driven by DC. The challenge will be around the way the federal government has often incentivized that policy in the states. And we saw that under Obama, and it's just unclear yet, I think, what is going to happen in that regard when federal money is being tied to a demand to implement particular policies.
I want to thank Melissa Murray for joining us. She has to leave for her conference. Next, we have a few questions related to the advanced manufacturing centers, asking for some more elaboration on how they work, what is likely to happen to these centers under Trump, and also that two-year colleges are traditionally assumed to train people for industry, and whether there is a role also for existing institutions to prepare manufacturing workers.
Okay, so thank you for that. The middle question, because it was something I left out. We simply don't know at this point what the Trump administration's policy is going to be. The preliminary budget made a 40% cut in the office in the National Institutes of Standards and Technology that oversees this program. But that we have seen this major turnaround by Trump on the Export-Import Bank. He campaigned against it, taking the Koch brothers line that it's corporate welfare and we don't need it, but he recently reversed that position. So that I think there's a good chance that as corporations pressure the President and the Congress and the Secretary of Commerce and say, we like these advanced manufacturing institutes, it's entirely possible that Trump will say, this is a good policy. It's very hard to predict. On the last question was community colleges, and they have been integrated into the programs of a number of these manufacturing institutes that they partnered with community colleges to deliver the curriculums to provide the labor force for these new kinds of factories. How they work, I recommend that you go look at this Deloitte report that I had in my slides. It kind of gives a very good description of the kind of networking task that they're doing. They're trying essentially to solve the problem that in these new industries, it's like, when your Apple TV doesn't work, properly, and you don't know whether it's the TV set, the cable company, or 7 different software providers or your own router. I mean, all of these advanced manufacturing industries represent a similar network phenomenon. There are multiple different organizations and firms that are involved in solving these production problems. And that's why these institutes are so important, because they bring these people under one umbrella and they efficiently allow them to make linkages and to solve problems and to build partnerships. And essentially in the old kind of Wild West version of American manufacturing, you didn't have institutions that solve that networking problem, and that's the problem they're trying to solve.
And is there an estimate for how many jobs these are likely to create?
No, I mean, it's essentially, a long-term project that, the fruits are going to show up in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And I think it's, again, not so much in terms of total number of jobs, but in the vitality of local economies, local and regional economies.
Thank you. Our next questions are on education. They'd like to hear more about the connection between the defunding of public education and the change in demographics, for instance, the increasing percentage of children of color in our population overall, and also from a person who used to work for a charter school in Oakland, that unruly or low-performing students are often sent back to public schools with no oversight or monitoring, even though charter schools are technically not allowed to do so. And what can be done about that?
So, thanks for those big old questions. So I guess to the first question, I think certainly we've seen incredible demographic shifts in this country, particularly in terms of public education enrollments, and that's for sure. But I'm not sure about the causal connection between the rise of market ideology and its role in public education. I'm not sure that's a purely demographic issue. I think it really is an ideological one. I think it's been located and found its footing in school districts that do primarily serve children of color, immigrant children, poor children, particularly because there was an awareness that that was where the greatest dissatisfaction was, right? So it's very hard to deconstruct something if you're happy with it. And so there's been a very intentional, I think, effort to focus on those districts. You know, for some well-meaning folks, it's to give families greater options. For others, it's really very clearly to dismantle the public education system, sort of one brick at a time, right? And to prey on the dissatisfaction is a core strategy. So I think there's that, but I think we always have to keep in mind that, you know, 80% of children who go to school in this country go to traditional public schools. So when we talk about the choice sector, we're talking about a very small percentage relative to public school enrollment. About 6% of U.S. school children are in charter schools, for example. It's a relatively small amount, and so, you know, most people, we all know the surveys, right, are very critical of U.S. public education, but rate their own schools quite highly, right? So, and again, it's not to say that there aren't issues in public education that need to be addressed in terms of equity and access, but we have a picture in which most kids in this country go to public schools, and most of the people closest to public schools like them. And so when we're talking about the kind of ideological movement to dismantle public education, there really is has been a long-standing animus for the idea that we provide public education in this country. For many conservatives, that's offensive, that education really is the responsibility of the family, right, taken at its most extreme. And so the idea that the state would do it is a real encroachment on that freedom and that liberty. And so we're seeing a kind of evolution of that thinking. There are choice adherents, certainly, who are progressive and leftist, and that their critique of the state comes from a very different perspective, but school choice has been an issue where those forces can be aligned. So I hope I answered that question, but let me know if I didn't. In terms of the out-migration of students from charter schools back into traditional public schools, we certainly know that that's a phenomenon, and the problem is with the kind of the charter school policy framework, which will say that things are prohibited, but we don't have a regulatory apparatus to hold charter schools accountable for these practices. And so we know that some families leave because they're unhappy, and choice theory says that's a good thing, right? But we also know that families are being counseled out of schools. Children who, you know, can't make it, in quotes, academically or in terms of behavior, are counseled out of charter schools and back into traditional public schools. And it's been a very, very difficult thing for researchers to track, frankly, because there's a lag in data in terms of enrollments. But in some places where charter schools have been implemented at scale, so in places like New Orleans, where most of the schools in the city are now charter schools, there's a researcher at the University of Texas, Faria Jabbar, who's done work with school principals about how they engage in competition for students, because you know, you have to attract students to stay alive institutionally. And a few of the informants talk about this moment where they know they want to get rid of children who are underperforming academically before testing happens, right? And they actually call it spring cleaning, right? So that there's this sort of colloquialism around these processes that I think researchers have yet to really fully account for and document. But I think certainly people on the ground in the kind of public education charter school ecosystem know these practices are happening.
Returning to the subject of healthcare policy, we have two questions regarding young people and why they aren't signing up as much, whether they're on their parents' policies or if they're not covered at all, if they're paying penalties, and whether there have been incentives provided to increase participation.
That's a good question. So under the Affordable Care Act, they implemented a law that said kids could be on their parents' plan up to the age of 26. I believe previously that had been 21. And so that's something that under the proposed Republican changes would stay the same, and there hasn't seemed to be much debate about that at all. And so typically, you know, when we think about these markets and when we talk about the young Invincibles, we're typically talking about people who are 26 and older. So typically people, you know, maybe 26 to 40 individuals. And the reason is that children are typically staying on their parents' plan until then. So why aren't they participating? You know, there's a number of reasons. First, they may not be aware that they should have health insurance. Second, the mandate is increasing over time, phased in terms of the penalties. Right now, the tax penalties are, they're not very large, and it's possible for a number of ways to get out of those penalties. Say if you're kind of a lower income person in this range, or something like that. And so so then these younger individuals, they say, well, we still have to pay some premiums, and we don't want to do that, and so they don't join the market. Another important thing to point out is those individuals are being pooled in the market with community rating, with individuals who are all the way up to age 65. And while there's some age rating that's allowed, what that means is that younger individuals are on average paying more than their healthcare costs when you think about the total premium. The final thing I'll mention here, which I think is a really important point for your question, is that one of the primary reasons why the young invincibles and why the exchanges have trouble attracting these people is that most individuals in the U.S. get an insurance through their employers, and the reason that's the case is that employers have a tax exemption for premiums. So your employer doesn't pay taxes on the premiums that you pay or that they pay for you. One result of that is that employers offer a lot of coverage. That's the more attractive way to offer and gain coverage. And so pretty much any young individual who's employed in any sort of job, or any older individual, they're going to get insurance through their employer, and they're definitely not going to go to the exchanges. And so that's more of a general point, but the number of people who these markets can actually pick from is not that large once you kind of take out the employer markets. You're really talking about people who are churning through jobs, or people without jobs, or without jobs that offer insurance.
We have another question on the implications of a continuous coverage provision, and what the implications are for distributive justice, and whether such a provision would negatively impact people with less stable incomes.
It's a good question. So the continuous coverage provision, from an economic sense, the reason why it's not as good a policy as a mandate is that what the continuous coverage provision is trying to do is make people buy insurance now in the market and not come into the market just when they get sick. And that's necessary when you have community rating regulations where you're basically charging everybody the same price. The problem with the continuous coverage provision is it charges you a penalty for re-entering the market once you've been out of the market. First, it's bad in the way the question asked. If your income is churning and there's some point where you have a really negative income shock and you have to leave the insurance market because you can't afford any premiums at all, basically we're penalizing those people when they come back into the market. And that's not necessarily that different from a mandate, which penalizes people without insurance. So that depends on the subsidy. The second issue, which is the biggest issue, or a big issue with the continuous coverage provision, is that with the penalty, you're actively discouraging people from re-entering the market, when the whole point of this kind of provision to begin with is to encourage people to be in the market. So it's fine if people always have insurance coverage because of this penalty, but when you have this negative income shock and you get out of the market, then you're going to be discouraging those people from re-entering. And a mandate, which is just basically a flat penalty for not being in the market, doesn't do that. In fact, it encourages you to be in the market. And so those are the big economic differences, and those do have implications for people who are churning through their jobs and justice.
Thank you. We're at our time, so I want to thank all of the panelists for their remarks.